All right, everybody, welcome back. We are back with another deep dive, and today we are tackling Plato's Cave.
One of my favorites.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But we're adding a twist this time.
Ooh, a twist.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at it through the lens of this personality test thing that we found over on this Spiritual Seek.
Oh, Spiritual Seek. Yeah, I love that website.
It's a gold mine. I mean, for anybody who is into, like, you know, philosophy and spirituality and all this kind of like mind-bending stuff.
For sure.
You know?
Sure.
So for folks who maybe haven't like gone down the rabbit hole of the Spiritual Seek, what would you tell them about it?
Yeah, so, it's a website and they have all these resources, these articles and these quizzes, and it's all about kind of like helping you figure out your place in the world.
Yeah.
And like what you believe in, and it really makes you question like everything.
Yes, it does. It does. So today we're going to be looking at this personality test specifically through the lens of Plato's Cave.
Yeah. Which
is, again, for folks who maybe need a little refresher. This idea that there are these prisoners who have lived their entire lives chained in this cave.
Yeah.
Right? And all they've ever seen are these shadows on the wall.
Just shadows.
And they think that that is reality. That is the world, right?
It's all they know.
But then one of the prisoners escapes, and he goes out in the world and sees the sun, sees like actual reality as it is,
right,
and comes back to tell the other prisoners, and of course they don't believe him.
Right, they're like, you're crazy, what are you talking about?
But they think he's insane.
Yeah.
Right? So the ideas are, we kind of like those prisoners in a way. You know, in our modern world, are we sort of trapped in our own little caves?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this personality test really gets at that.
Yeah. Yeah, let's dive into these statements because they're pretty juicy.
Okay.
So this first one really kind of hit me hard. Philosophy is a waste of time.
Oh, man.
I mean, I'm sure there are some folks out there who would actually agree with that.
Yeah.
But how does agreeing with this relate to, like, stuck in Plato's cave?
Yeah. Okay, well, you got to think. If those prisoners in the cave, like, right? They weren't exactly like, sitting around talking about like the meaning of life.
Right. Yeah.
They weren't having these deep philosophical debates, right?
No.
So if you're saying that philosophy is a waste of time, you're basically saying that like, critical thinking is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Questioning things is a waste of time, and that's what keeps you in the cave.
Right. And, you think about it in our world today, there's so much information being thrown at us from all sides.
It's overwhelming.
It's completely overwhelming, right? Like we've got algorithms, we've got the media, social media, all these different sources that are telling us what to think, what to believe.
What to buy.
What to buy, exactly. And so if we're not taking the time to kind of like step back and be like, wait a minute, is this actually true?
Where's this information coming from?
What's the agenda here? Like we can really get stuck in a cave of our own making.
Right. And what's interesting is that like the prisoners in the cave, like they didn't choose to be there.
Right.
But we kind of do when we don't question these things.
That's a really good point. It's like we're choosing to stay in the shadows, We
have the key, but we're not using it.
Exactly. All right, so this next one is interesting. Television is essential for staying informed. Okay. I mean, I get it. A lot of people do get their news from television.
Sure.
But how does this tie into this idea of, like, seeing shadows and mistaking them for reality?
So think of it like this, the things on the television are not the actual events themselves.
Right.
Right? They are like a representation, a version of it, and they can be edited, they can be biased.
But they can be taken out of context.
Out of context, exactly.
And so if we're just passively, like, absorbing whatever's on TV and not, like you were saying before, questioning it, looking at different sources, we're really only getting this, like, limited slice of the pie.
And sometimes a very small slice.
Right, and it might not even be the most accurate slice.
Absolutely, and it's also important to think about who's controlling the narrative, who's deciding what gets shown on TV.
Yes, and how it's presented, right?
Exactly.
Because that can really influence how we perceive something.
Well, it's not to say that you can't get any information from television,
right? But
just to be aware that it's not the full picture.
It's not the whole truth, right?
Exactly.
It's like you're only seeing the shadows of the events and not the events themselves.
It's like a shadow puppet show.
Ooh, that's a good analogy. Okay, so this next one I think is going to resonate with a lot of people. Constantly asking yourself questions is harmful. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, our whole show is kind of about asking questions, so this one feels a little counterintuitive, right?
It does.
How can asking questions be a bad thing?
Well, I think it's because questioning things can be uncomfortable.
Oh, right. Like when you start questioning things, you start challenging your assumptions, you might have to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself or about the world. And that can be really unsettling.
Yeah, and sometimes it's easier to just kind of like go with the flow and not rock the boat, you know?
Absolutely.
But the thing is, if that one prisoner hadn't questioned what he was seeing, if he hadn't been like, wait a minute, there's got to be something more than this, he never would have escaped.
That's true. It's that curiosity that drives us to learn and grow.
Right. And if we just shut down our curiosity, we're basically choosing to stay in that cave.
We're choosing the comfort of the familiar, even if it's not the truth.
Right. Okay, this one's a little spicy. Reality is clear. There is no conspiracy or deception.
Ooh, that's a bold statement.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if that were true?
I would love to live in a world like that.
Right. But does it actually hold up, you know?
Well, again, think about the prisoners in the cave. They thought their reality was clear, too.
They did. They had it all figured out.
Yeah. They had their whole system figured out, right?
Yeah.
Until one of them broke free and saw that there was a whole other world out there, a whole other reality.
Right. And we've seen throughout history how easily reality can be manipulated.
Oh, yeah.
How information can be controlled, how propaganda can be used to shape people's beliefs.
And how people in power can use that to their advantage.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily about becoming like, a conspiracy theorist or anything, but it's about having that like healthy sense of skepticism,
Critical thinking, questioning things.
Exactly. Questioning like, okay, who's benefiting from this narrative? Who's controlling the information that I'm getting?
And what's their agenda?
Yeah, what's their agenda? Right.
Yeah.
Because things are not always what they seem.
Not always.
And I think it's important to remember that.
Okay, so the next statement is, if something is hard to understand, it is not for me.
Ooh, I have definitely felt that way before. Yeah, sometimes you encounter a concept or an idea that's just like,
Yeah.
ugh, it's too much for my brain to handle,
Like reading a really dense philosophical text.
Oh, yes, or like trying to understand quantum physics or something.
Exactly.
But how does this relate to this whole idea of escaping the cave?
Well, think about it. If that escaped prisoner had said that, oh, this sunlight is too bright for me, this world is too complicated, I'm just going to go back to my comfy cave.
He never would have like actually experienced the world.
He would have missed out.
Right. And so I think in the same way, if we just shy away from anything that's like, challenging or difficult to understand,
that we're limiting ourselves.
We're choosing to stay in that little bubble of what we already know.
And, sometimes the most rewarding things are the things that challenge us the most.
Right. Like, I think about all the books that I've read that have really like changed my perspective, or the documentaries I've watched that have like blown my mind.
Yeah.
Those were not always easy to digest at first.
Right. They make you think. Right.
But they were so worth it in the end because they like expanded my understanding of the world.
And isn't that what it's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last one, and this is a doozy. Institutions work for our good and deserve utmost trust.
Ooh, that's a loaded one.
Yeah. So how does this one tie into this whole Plato's cave thing?
Okay, so think about those shadows on the cave wall, right? In a way, they're like the information that's being fed to the prisoners. They're a controlled reality, a version of the truth that's been curated and presented to them.
Okay.
Now, in our modern world, institutions like governments, corporations, the media,
Right.
they all have a certain amount of power, right? They control resources, they control information, they have the ability to shape the narrative.
And sometimes their interests might not align with our interests.
Exactly. And if we just blindly trust institutions without questioning their motives or holding them accountable,
Right.
then we're kind of like those prisoners accepting whatever shadows they choose to show us.
It's like we're giving them the power to create our reality for us.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be really dangerous.
Yeah, it's like we're saying, okay, you know better than I do, I'm just going to trust you.
Yeah.
Without even like thinking critically about what they're doing or why they're doing it.
Yeah.
So I think this statement is really challenging us to think about like where we place our trust and why.
To be discerning.
Yes, to be discerning. To not just blindly accept things, but to actually like, do our own research, ask questions, and think critically.
And I think it's important to remember that institutions are made up of people, and people are flawed.
Absolutely.
So institutions are going to be flawed too.
Right. They're not perfect, and they don't always have our best interests at heart.
So, yeah, question everything.
Question everything. It should be our new motto.
I love it.
So we've gone through all 6 of these statements from this Spiritual Seek quiz.
A lot to think about.
a lot to think about, but like what's the big takeaway here for our listeners?
Yeah.
Like what do we want them to walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that Plato's Caves is not just some like dusty old philosophical story,
Right.
It's actually really relevant to our lives today.
It's like a blueprint for how to think critically about the world.
Exactly. And these statements from the quiz really force us to confront the question, are we living in a cave?
Are we just accepting those shadows that curated reality, or are we willing to do the work to break free and see the world as it truly is?
And that's a choice that we all have to make.
And it's not always an easy choice, right?
It's not.
Because sometimes it's easier to stay in the cave. It's comfortable, it's familiar.
But it's also limiting.
It is limiting, and I think ultimately it's less fulfilling.
Absolutely.
So I hope that our listeners will, take these questions, these statements to heart and really use them to kind of like, examine their own lives and their own beliefs.
Challenge yourselves.
Yes, challenge yourselves. And if you're ready to like really dive deeper into this whole thing, I highly recommend checking out the Spiritual Seek.
It's a great resource.
It's a great resource. They have so much great stuff on there.
And one thing that I was thinking about with this quiz is that it actually asks you how much you like living in the cave.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it makes you think like, what is it about the cave that we might actually find appealing?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Like, why might we choose to stay in the shadows, even if we know that there's a whole other world out there?
Ooh, that's a good one to ponder.
Definitely something to think about.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Plato's Cave. It's been a real mind bender.
It has. Always a pleasure.
Until next time, keep questioning everything.
Keep searching.